When it comes to popular historical subjects, classical Rome is up there in the top, with the Second World War and ancient Egyptians. Byzantine history, on the other hand, barely receives any attention, despite being its direct continuation. In this video, we're going to figure out how this happened. How did the popular image of the Byzantine Empire form? And is this likely to change anytime soon? The popularity of classical Rome isn't hard to explain. Ancient Romans were all about looking cool and winning big. Like in Roman history is a nerd equivalent of being a fan of a dominant football team. So it is more or less expected that Byzantium, which wasn't as dominant, garners way less interest. However, popular ignorance about the Eastern Roman Empire is still vastly disproportionate to its historical significance, even if we take objective factors into account. That's because there are also subjective factors at play. Believe it or not, before the 18th century, Byzantine history was actually very popular in Europe. Often when people talk about the origins of the term Byzantium, there is this narrative that the evil West always tried to denigrate and besmirch the Eastern Romans by any means, but that wasn't really the case. Hieronymus Wolff, the guy who coined the term, didn't do it with malicious intent. He actually contributed quite a lot to the studies of the Eastern Roman Empire. He considered the Byzantine history a subject that is separate but not inferior to classical Rome. His works and the works of his disciples made Byzantium a very popular topic among European scholars. Different groups were attracted to it for different reasons. The Catholics studied it to work towards a union with the Orthodox Church, while the Protestants related to its anti-papal narratives. France became the main center of Eastern Roman studies when Louis XIV sponsored the publication of the first complete edition of Byzantine historical sources. Things were looking very optimistic for all Byzantium enjoyers. But everything changed when the Enlightenment nation attacked. There were two big Enlightenment trends that are important to us, like in classical antiquity and skepticism of religion. I bet you can see how this would be detrimental to the popularity of Byzantium. Dismissal of the Eastern Romans can already be found quite early in the works of French Enlightenment thinkers like Montesquieu and Voltaire. Here's what Voltaire writes. "There is another history even more ridiculous. That is Byzantine history. This unworthy collection contains only declamations and miracles. It is the disgrace of the human mind, just as the Greek Empire was the reproach of the earth." French Enlightenment was also, among other things, about dunking on Louis XIV and French absolutism. And considering the fact that Louis was a patron of Byzantine studies, they quickly fell out of fashion by association. Because of this association, the Byzantine Empire started being branded as Oriental despotism, even though Montesquieu himself argues that Eastern Romans weren't paying enough respect to government authority. Louis was despotic and he liked Byzantium. That means it was also a despotism. The Eastern Roman Empire simply didn't fit into the Enlightenment narrative of world history. Classical Rome and Greece were supposed to be the progenitors of the West, and the Persian Empire was the embodiment of the East. These two weren't supposed to be linked at all, so the Byzantine history with its fusion of Western and Eastern influences was dismissed and ignored. To drive the point home, the Eastern Roman Empire was called a sad epilogue to the glory of Rome, a tissue of rebellions, insurrections and treachery, and 1,000 years of decline. Byzantine art and architecture were discarded as derivative, reconquests as insignificant, and technological achievements as fictional. Voltaire even denies that Greek fire ever existed, because how could such a backwards civilization produce such an advanced technology? Now, mind you, these weren't yet works of history in an academic sense. For Montesquieu and Voltaire, history is more of a branch of literature, and a field to promote their philosophical theories by cherry-picking fitting examples. In every age, there is no shortage of windbags, claiming that the entire world history proves their political views, and they don't necessarily have an impact on people who are doing actual historical research. But in 1776, along came a book that ingrained the idea of Byzantine inferiority in the minds of academics, and, in the words of Christopher Kelly, killed the Byzantine studies for nearly a century. I am talking, of course, about Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon was also a man of enlightenment, and as such he really wanted to convince people that the Roman Empire fell because of Christianity. But this thesis can't work if there is a Christian Roman Empire in the East that lives on for another 1,000 years. That's why he had to employ the same tactics as the French and denigrate Byzantium as the triumph of barbarism and religion. It's pretty obvious that Gibbon didn't actually want to write about the later empire. For context, he spends 3 full chapters and a total of 100 pages on Julian the Apostate, who only ruled for 3 years, but speedruns from the birth of Islam to the First Crusade in 50 pages. The worst thing about The Decline and Fall is that it is actually a very well-written book. Had Gibbon been a bad writer, his magnum opus would have been quickly forgotten, since no one has the patience to read through 6 volumes of subpar prose. But unfortunately for the progress of the Byzantine studies, Edward Gibbon was an excellent writer. The first volumes up to the reign of Heraclius are very detailed and present a solid analysis of factors that led to the collapse of Roman rule in the West. Gibbon's rigor in working with the primary sources that were available to him was unprecedented for the time. In terms of historical methodology, the book was revolutionary. For academic history, it did what Wealth of Nations did for the field of economics. Sure, there's a very clear bias, but this bias was easily palatable for the 18th century reader. Gibbon simply projects the intellectual mainstream of his age to the historical work that he's writing. The influence of Voltaire and Montesquieu are obvious and apparent. Throughout Decline and Fall, there are 51 mentions of Montesquieu and 41 of Voltaire. It was also an especially hot topic for the British audience. The Whigs of 18th century England, including Gibbon, viewed the Romans as honorary Englishmen, the Roman Senate as a proto-parliament, and thought that the British Empire was currently living through a golden age of stability and prosperity, akin to the age of Augustus. The contemporary period in English literature is even called Augustan humanism. It's pretty ironic to us how Gibbon posited the stability of British rule in a book published mere weeks before the American Revolution, but that was the dominant political view of the British elite at the time. Britain is the new Rome because of the freedoms and political representation. The anti-religious vibe may seem detrimental to the book's mainstream popularity, but that wasn't really the case. Gibbon doesn't offer a blanket condemnation of Christianity as a whole. That wouldn't have passed censorship in 18th century Britain. Instead, he criticizes the hierarchical clergy and the involvement of the church in secular affairs, which is a pretty standard Protestant take. The Decline and Fall turned out to be incredibly influential. It propelled ancient Rome to new heights of popularity and pioneered a new, more academical and analytical methodology for the discipline of history. Unfortunately, it also did great damage to the reputation of the Byzantine Empire and its popularity as a historical subject. The fact that Gibbon writes with such passion about the earlier periods and then just loses all interest after Heraclius signaled to the audience that there's probably not anything interesting after that. And Gibbon clearly states that himself. The summary of his chapter 48 is, "Everything past Heraclius is hella boring and you shouldn't bother with it. Except maybe the Komnenians, they're kind of okay. Should I persevere in the same course, should I observe the same measure, a prolix and slender thread would be spun through many a volume, nor would the patient reader find an adequate reward of instruction or amusement. At every step, as we sink deeper in the decline and fall of the Eastern Empire, the annals of each succeeding reign would impose a more ungrateful and melancholy task. These annals must continue to repeat a tedious and uniform tale of weakness and misery." And the readers of the time took this advice to heart. Whenever you look into mentions of Byzantium in the Western sources of the next 100 years, it's all about Oriental despotism, superstitious barbarians, effeminate weaklings, and backwards Asiatics. Gibbon isn't actually the worst in this regard, even though he was the main influencer of this trend. Occasionally, he has something nice to say about Byzantium, so for the most egregious takes, we should look to his disciples. This passage from an Irish essayist, William Lecky, can just be the apogee of Gibbonism. Of that Byzantine Empire, the universal verdict of history is that it constitutes, without a single exception, the most thoroughly base and despicable form civilization has yet assumed. Though very cruel and very sensual, there have been times when cruelty assumed more ruthless and sensuality more extravagant aspects, but there has been no other enduring civilization so absolutely destitute of all forms and elements of greatness. The Byzantine Empire was preeminently the age of treachery. Its vices were the vices of men who ceased to be brave without learning to be virtuous. Slaves were willing to be slaves, in both their action and their thought, immersed in sensuality and in the most frivolous pleasure. The history of the empire is a monstrous story of the intrigues of priests, eunuchs, and women, of poisonings, of conspiracies, of uniform ingratitude, of perpetual fratricides. If I sincerely believed this to be true, I wouldn't want to learn about Byzantium either. But not everything was that bleak. Despite the many slides from the classical Rome fans, true Byzantine enjoyers remained steadfast. In 1856, a Scottish historian, George Finlay, published the first volume of his History of the Byzantine Empire. It was much more substantive than Gibbon's writings, and didn't have such a blatant bias. Everyone now saw how fascinating the Eastern Roman Empire was, and Byzantine history became more popular in Victorian England than tea and crumpets. Well, not exactly. But at least now there was an alternative to the doomer narrative of Gibbon. For once, the history of Byzantium in English was being written by people who actually enjoyed the subject. The appearance of many new Byzantine scholars in the late 1800s wasn't a coincidence. The Greek Independence War saw Russian, French, and British soldiers fighting for the Greek cause. George Finlay was one of them. Over the next few decades, the contact between European powers in Greece has strengthened, more translations of the medieval works have appeared, and a greater appreciation for the Byzantine studies have emerged. The following decades were a long struggle against Gibbon's legacy, both in academic circles and in popular imagination. The efforts in the first department were more successful. New Byzantine histories were written in Britain, Germany, and Russia. Indexing the works of Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus reinvigorated researchers' interest in the empire's heritage. Irish historian J.B. Barrie was the first to argue against using the word Byzantium to restore Eastern Romans to their historical identity. By the middle of the 20th century, the academic field had fully recovered from the blow dealt by Gibbon's book. George Ostrogorsky's History of the Byzantine State is a perfect summarization of the work done in those decades to restore the image of the Eastern Roman Empire. But the mainstream perception lagged quite far behind. With the advent of cinema and Hollywood, historical epics about classical Rome soon became some of the biggest cinematic attractions. Spartacus, Quo Vadis, Ben-Hur, and the Fall of the Roman Empire all attracted massive budgets and big audiences, thus further contributing to Rome's popularity. The Byzantines, on the other hand, had no representation on the big screen. The Eastern Roman Empire remained a niche subject for a few enthusiasts, not a household name that could attract a casual audience. But things were slowly getting better. People interested in history were getting more material about Byzantium. Writers like John Julius Norwich and Lars Brownworth based their popular history books on the works that came along after Gibbon, and with that they managed to present a more sympathetic image of the Eastern Roman Empire. Not a tedious tale of misery, but a gripping story with many ups and downs, filled with ensembles of memorable characters. Even though the information in those books is considered outdated by the modern academic standards, for many readers they became an entry point to the many-faceted history of the underappreciated empire. The stereotypes of backwardness, religious fanaticism, and effeminacy were being slowly but steadily whittled away. Don't get me wrong, Gibbonist views are still alive and well. Particularly in the West, if you meet someone who has heard about Byzantium, chances are his or her first associations would be backwards Asiatics and 1,000 years of decline. They may not be aware where they got it from, but you can be sure they will accuse you of trying to rewrite history if you dare to challenge those notions. Despite this, my outlook on the future of public knowledge about Eastern Romans is still positive. More and more people are discovering Byzantine history for the first time through social media, YouTube videos, and podcasts. The academic Byzantine studies have been a big mess for a couple of decades, with all the old dogmas being challenged and every topic having 5 competing claims at the same time. But that's probably what an active research discipline should look like. Looking at how the big historical productions from Hollywood and Netflix have been turning out lately, I'm kind of glad they've been ignoring Byzantium so far. God knows we don't need any more rage bait at this moment. Hopefully, one day we will get something good. I hope you enjoyed this video. Tell me in the comments if you think that Byzantine history is likely to become more popular in the near future. I'd like to thank my patrons Mulai Cherkawi, Conventus Orbis, Picamist, and others who are supporting me on Patreon. And for the rest of you, thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you in the next one.